Welcome to our webinar called Wisdom of the Body, Herbivore Culture. Our presenter today is Dr. Fred Provenza. This webinar is the third and final segment in a three-part series hosted by Food Animal Concerns Trust. I am Larissa McKenna, FACT's Humane Farming Program Director, and I will be moderating today's session. So thank you for being here, everyone. Let me take a minute to give a few quick introductions before we dive right in. Food Animal Concerns Trust, or FACT. We are a national nonprofit organization. We're headquartered in Illinois, and we work to ensure that all food-producing animals are raised in a healthy and humane manner. And we accomplish this by supporting humane farmers, promoting policies that make food from animals safe and healthy to eat, and also by helping consumers make informed food choices. So I have the honor and pleasure of directing FACT's Humane Farming Program, one of the best jobs in the world, I think. I get to work with livestock and poultry farmers across the country to serve your needs, including offering grants, scholarships, customized materials, mentorship program, and of course, we like to provide webinars on fascinating topics such as this one. So please visit our website to learn more about our farmer services. So at this time, I am absolutely delighted to introduce our presenter, the one and only Fred Provenza. Fred grew up in Colorado, working on a ranch while attending school in wildlife biology at Colorado State University. He's currently a professor emeritus of behavioral ecology in the Department of Wildland Resources at Utah State University, where he's worked for 35 years, directing a research group that has pioneered an understanding of how learning influences foraging behavior and how behavior links soils, plants, animals, and humans. So it is our great honor and pleasure to have him back with us today, so that will be able to share his wisdom with us all. So without further ado, Fred, I think I'm going to turn the floor over to you, so you may get started.
Okay, thank you, Larissa. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you. It's an honor and a privilege for sure to do that. And as I mentioned in all three of them, more to have a conversation with everyone, to have the conversation. I don't see myself as any guru on any of this stuff, but it's about the conversation. And so today, let's have the conversation about herbivore culture. And these are the topics that we've been going through. We began with Let Feed Be Thy Medicine, and then we moved on last time to Let Food Be Our Medicine, and then this time we'll talk about herbivore culture. And there have been some really good questions that have come in after each session, and let me just mention them briefly because they're related in one way or another to all three of these topics. The first one was, why are my calves growing so slowly at 6 months? They're only weighing 300 to 400 pounds. And that's a very good question. And I would, to do a decent job of answering that question, I'd need to know more about what the forages are that those calves are on right now. No doubt that's going to play a really important role in that. And so, as I've said before to Larissa, I'm happy to visit either by phone or correspond by email with folks related to questions, but I'd like to have more information on that because it's a really good question. A related question is it practical to finish lambs on perennial pasture during the forage growing season in Michigan? I don't see why it wouldn't be practical to do that. We were certainly doing that when I was in my last 10 years or so at Utah State University on the pasture program. We were having success doing that. Again, as we talked about in the Let Feed Be Thy Medicine part of the presentation, it really depends on the mix of plants that you have available, what you're going to be able to see in terms of growth rate and performance of animals. So again, be happy to visit more one-on-one about that. There are two other questions that are related. One is, I've heard you can train goats to focus on eating invasive plants. How do you do it? Second is cost benefits of training ruminants to eat invasive noxious weeds. Those are both really interesting and important topics. In the first section, Let Feed Be Thy Medicine, we alluded to that. We alluded to the flexibility for animals to be able to learn what and what not to eat. Today, we're going to talk even more about that. And Larissa and I were talking, if there is great interest in that topic, maybe next fall or winter, we could put together a presentation that's specifically focused on training animals to utilize invasive species and weeds. I'd also mention my friend and colleague Kathy Voth, who worked with our program for many, many years and then went into business for herself. And one of the businesses she was doing was training livestock to be weed eaters. There's a lot of potential to do that. I'll explore it a little bit today, but certainly not nearly as much as we could. That's related to another question. I'm in the Appalachian region, trying to establish an organic native pasture for sheep. The land has been mismanaged for years by a farmer who rented it for cattle. It's mostly andropogon species. Do you recommend burning or some other method to establish native forbs and grasses? Obviously, I won't be using herbicides. Another really good question. I have not worked specifically with andropogon. I think burning is one practice that can be utilized. We had a plant called crested wheatgrass that was planted on really millions of acres in the western U.S. as a spring forage, but it's incredibly competitive and it grows in monocultures. It's hard for other plant species to invade crested wheatgrass. I was involved early on in my career with a program trying to reduce the abundance of crested wheatgrass, not with herbicides, but with grazing by sheep and cattle. And we were targeting the plant at the stage of growth when it was most vulnerable and then doing some seeding. So we were hitting it really hard, grazing it during the boot stage, the late vegetative and early reproductive stage, when we knew we could do the most damage to the plant. You know, if you want to manage properly on plants, you wouldn't graze then, but we were deliberately trying to overgraze it during that time period, very high stock densities, and then seeding after that with some of the perennials diversity that we wanted in there. So that's just a few words on that topic, but it's again related to this idea of reducing the abundance of invasives that we might want to do a whole session on. The other the other four questions are all related to where we want to go today. Let me briefly mention them. I would like to overwinter sheep, mostly outdoors in northern half of Minnesota. Do I need especially bred sheep, or can I assume that milking breeds will be capable of surviving? How about timing of breeding? We're going to really talk about those things today. Would using native breeds suited to each farmer's particular area be more useful long-term alongside running a closed flock when compared to buying the biggest, baddest bull and the favorite breed possibly unsuited to the location and ground? That's, to me, another just super right-on question, and we're going to be talking about that today. Third question, could you talk about matching the animal livestock breed to the purpose goal the landowner may want to achieve? And again, from the standpoint of local adaptation, that's where we're going today. Last, what criteria should a shepherd use, and how would you rank, prioritize the criteria to make culling decisions? And again, we're going to be talking about selecting for locally adapted animals and culling in that sense. So with that, by way of background, let's move into the topic. And I want to start with the story. Larissa mentioned I was on the ranch 50 years ago now. Doesn't seem like it, but I was working with the man in this picture here, Henry DeLuca, and he'd spent his lifetime on that ranch. And I remember specifically, it was during my sophomore year in college. I'd come back come back to the ranch after taking classes in the spring semester, and one of the classes was on genetics and breeds, different breeds of animals, and all discussions of those kind of topics and the importance of genetics and heterosis and so forth. And I'd noticed when during that first year, I was learning from Henry on the ranch that he always kept his own replacement animals. There was a breed that he preferred. He liked Herefords, and in this picture in the lower left, it's not Herefords. I never took pictures when I was on the ranch any of those years, but that's the country we were in. That's the lower elevation country. And we'd go clear to timberline on that big mountain, Mount Chavanaugh, in the background, over thousands of acres. So that's the country we were running in. And I noticed that Henry always kept his own replacements. He didn't want crossbreeds. He didn't want any of that business. And so I asked him, and this will date me in many ways, but I was just working for him for nothing, basically $250 a month, work 10-hour days, 6 days a week. But in Henry's credit, he would always take time to talk with you. And so I asked him this question. I said, why don't you bring in other animals, buy other bulls, or bring other replacement animals? And he sat down and he just started telling me stories of his experiences over time. His experience when, for reasons I won't get into for lack of time, he had to move his entire cattle herd to a totally different range. He said it was pregnancy rates fell through the floor. It was the year from hell, he said. Then he started telling me, he said, how we on horseback move cattle around all these allotments on this big Mount Chavanaugh area. And he said, you will remember too that they're all in little groups. They're not in one big herd. It isn't one big herd up there. It's little groups of animals that are in different parts of any one pasture. And so we know where we have to go when we're moving animals, for instance, from Blanks to Droney or to Weldon or these places that were names up there. Said we know we're going to have to go many different places within this pasture to find these little groups. And he said, if you bring in animals and he said, I've done it. I've brought in replacement animals, even Herefords. And he said, you don't know if you're going to find them. You don't know where you're going to find them. And odds are they are not going to be bred when they come down from the forest during the summertime. He said, it's going to be a wreck. So he said, the basic problem is the animals just don't know the range. And when I think of all the research I spent my career on, it's all came from the ranch and this question, what does it mean to know the range? So let me give you some, so here's where we've been going then. We've been talking about this wisdom of the body, which is intimately linked with what it means to know the range. And we've been talking about the roles of availability of alternative foods, plant diversity. We've talked about flavor feedback relationships and their relationship with diversity and so forth. And then today, the social culture. So we said those are the three legs of the stool of the wisdom of the body. And they're really the three legs of the stool that get linked with what it means to know the range. So I've got some food for thought questions for you from different things that happened during my career working with this. And the first one is a study that we did with an animal nutritionist. We were interested in trying to reduce costs of feeding during the winter. And rather than feeding more expensive alfalfa, this nutritionist was looking at feeding ammoniated straw throughout the winter period. And so we had this study. We had cows that were 5 years old when we started the study. They were fed ammoniated straw from December through May, and the study lasted 3 years. Now, half of the cows in that study performed really well from the get-go. The other half didn't perform well at all in terms of any measure you want, and we'll get into this. But the question is, we had a very uniform group as relates to breed and sex, of course, all cows and so forth. They were very uniform, and yet we had these really marked differences, half performing well, half not performing well at all. So the question is, what's going on? What happened? I'm going to also talk about habitat selection in this session today. We haven't mentioned a word about it, and yet we did a lot of studies over the years on why do animals eat what they eat, but why do they go where they go? And this role of culture in that. And early on in my career, I heard a wonderful seminar from some researchers in Norway, and they were studying populations of moose across the country. And they said most populations of moose uh, migrate seasonally. They go to higher elevations in the summertime, and then they work their way down to low elevations where they spend the wintertime. But they said we identified population of moose that don't do that. They spend all year round at the higher elevations. And in the summer that's great, but in the winter it's really tough conditions. So the question that they were discussing at that point was, why do the moose do this? Why? There's no barriers. There are no physical barriers. These moose could easily be going from high elevations in the summer to low elevations in the winter, but they don't do it. So their question was why? And then a further question was related to differences in those different moose populations, we could say, in terms of form and function. There's a third food for thought that I have for you, and it comes from work that we did with bison over the years. And I want to read you this food for thought. It's out of this book here. In the Buffalo Harvest, Frank Meyer asks a question. He says, do you remember reading about buffalo herds millions strong, moving in a solid mass and stopping trains and wagons? Of course, the herd, this vast mass of animals, would be under the leadership of a grand old buffalo bull who would trot serenely at its head, issuing orders and demanding instant and complete obedience. He said, isn't that about the picture as you have it in your mind? And certainly I see there's people from different countries on here, but for those of us in the US raised with this, that is the picture we have in our mind, these massive, massive herds. But Frank Meyer goes on to say, if that is your idea of how they work, get it out of there fast, because the fact is that no buffalo herd I ever saw numbered over 200 animals, and most of them were very much smaller. Most of the herds would run from 3 to 60 animals with an average of around 15. In these small groups, the buffalo traveled and fed, scattered over the plains, but each one separate and apart from the other herds. Whenever they stampeded, they did come together and charged as one vast solid herd, but when the fright had passed, they'd separate into their peculiar small herd formation. He says, do keep these herds in mind. They were important to us in our hunting. In fact, let me tell you how. So that's the food for thought question. And I probably shouldn't take the time to do this, Larissa, but I want to tell a little story here that's kind of humorous. Again, for those in the US and for those who are old enough, there was a show on TV called Cheers. And a lot of people loved watching that show. And so they're talking about buffalo there. And one of the characters is named Cliff. And he's visiting with another one called Norm over a few beers in this well-known TV show called Cheers. And Cliff says, well, you see, Norm, it's like this. A herd of buffalo can only move as fast as the slowest buffalo. And when the herd is hunted, it's the lowest and weakest ones at the back that are killed first. This natural selection is good for the herd as a whole because the general speed and health of the whole group keeps improving by the regular killing of the weakest members. Now, this would be kind of a thought that the person might have about this, but he goes on to say, in much the same way, the human brain can only operate as fast as the slowest brain cells. Now, as we know, excessive intake of alcohol kills brain cells, but naturally, it attacks the slowest and weakest brain cells first. In this way, regular consumption of beer eliminates the weaker brain cells, making the brain a faster and more efficient machine. And that, Norm, is why you always feel smarter after a few beers. So that's not really what's going on there. But we'll come back to what was happening. From a human standpoint, Paul Rosen says this. He says, suppose one wishes to know as much as possible about the foods another person likes and eats and can ask only one question. What should that question be? Now, I could leave that as a food for thought, but I'm going to use it as a way simply to segue into where we're going here. And he says, there's no doubt about it. The question should be, what is your culture or ethnic group? And then he goes on to talk about the diversity of diets of peoples around the globe, from people in northern latitudes that have very much meat dominated diets, to people in the tropics that have a great deal of fruits and vegetables, plant matter in their diets, to these elaborate different cuisines of India or France, and so forth and so on. So he says there's no other single question that would even approach the amount of information in the answer to that question. And I would second that for everything we ever did related to food and habitat selection by domestic, and I'd say by the wild animals as well. The other thing that I want to mention here, because this is what makes it very local, when I was writing the book Nourishment, I was reading about the Mediterranean diet. And here in the States, we've all heard about the Mediterranean diet, and we assume that that's a certain kind of food. But when researchers in Italy tried to study the Mediterranean diet, it doesn't exist, because it's so local what people eat in the Mediterranean region. There is no Mediterranean diet. And I would say that very same thing as relates to livestock. It becomes very local in terms of adaptation and what they learn to forage on. So we'll go there as we go through this presentation. And let's start with wild animals. And there was a review paper written back in 2004 by Davis and Stamps. And what they were pointing out is that natal experiences affect food and habitat selection in this broad array of taxa, everything from insects to fish to birds to mammals. It was truly an amazing paper because of the breadth that they covered. And you might not think that that earthworm there would develop preferences for the habitat where it was born and raised, but they do. And that bluebird there, that mountain bluebird, when Sue and I were living in the backwoods of Colorado in late February, early March, these bluebirds, which are neotropical migrants, would start to show up, and they'd spend the spring and the summer and then the early fall, and then they'd migrate down south. But what the point I'm making is that when you ban those birds, when you put a ban on them, you start to realize that it's the same birds that come back to exactly the same places. They nest in the same places. It's not random what's happening. And their offspring, born and raised in a particular place, are going to come back to those same environments as well. So why do they do that? It's the home field advantage. We often talk about the home field advantage and how important that is in sports. But imagine if your life depends on it, if your ability to not only survive but thrive depends on knowing what and what not to eat, where and where not to go, what's a predator, what's not a predator. When a bird of a different species or an animal of a different species makes a particular call, and we know this, what does that call mean? That's information, and all that's learned kind of information. And so there's this appreciation from this kind of work of the value of these experiences early in life, in terms of ability of animals to survive and thrive in habitats. So it was not surprising, and this goes back to Henry talking about the animals don't know the range, that when we started studying these things, when we started looking at diet and habitat selection and started looking at the role of mother, it was, we started with mother as a model. Just do lambs learn, or kid goats or calves, do they learn from mom? And it was amazing to see. It absolutely will. And I was going to show you a video. It gets your attention in major ways, how much they pay attention and how quickly they learn. Then I thought, well, mother's probably having an influence even before they start to forage through flavors in her milk. And sure enough, that's easy to demonstrate. And then it dawned on us, it probably even starts in utero, with young animals learning about flavors in mother's diets through compounds that get into the amniotic fluid. And so I want to review that kind of information as we go along here, and then I want to link it to what it means to be locally adapted. So, thinking about this, I would say that mother adds stability. Her knowledge of the landscape um, is vitally important, but it's dynamic. Offspring also contribute to this. The young animals, once they start to forage, once they've learned, and they learn very quickly, learned what from mom, they influence one another, and they maybe some things, and this relates back to that question of invasive plants and plants that animals may not have ever included in their diet before. Young animals are a way to get new plants into the diet. They learn from one another, and then they also can, in some cases, retrain the mothers. Here's an example we got involved in years ago. It was in Oregon, I think Oregon or Washington State here in the U.S., and the Forest Service or one of the timber companies, can't remember which, doesn't matter, had contracted a livestock producer, a sheep producer with 1,000 head of animals to contract graze in these forest plantations. They had these young seedlings, and what they wanted was the sheep to graze the understory, and in that way reduce competition so that the seedlings would grow more, have more access to nutrients and water and even sunlight. And so, and we know that that works. So that's an established thing. And the idea was, so let's let the sheep do that as a low cost way to do it. The producer, livestock producer, gets forage for his animals. We get reduced competition and enhanced growth for our trees. So they entered into this long-term contract, and the first year everything worked like a charm. Sheep came in, did just exactly what they needed to do. Everyone was happy. The next year, though, as they got into the grazing season and the plants started the trees started to grow, the tree seedlings started to grow, these little, what they're called candles, this new growth, this lighter colored growth, the lambs started to sample that. Probably much like those goats in the woodrat houses that I talked about in the first session. Some goat starts to sample that, his buddies see it. Pretty soon, all of the lambs are eating, but they're the mothers are learning from the lambs, so that by the end of the year, not only are the lambs eating some of these candles, but the ewes are too. So that was pretty distressing to the folks, but they thought, let's give it a go the third year and hope that things that we've got a new crop of lambs, and that the mothers aren't going to remember. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. The mothers did remember very well when the trees started to shoot out the candles to grow. The mothers were on it, and the mothers were training the lambs. So we'd gone from ewes that didn't know to eat this to lambs that trained the ewes, and then to ewes that were training the lambs. So I'm simply making the point that it's a dynamic, and animals are learning from one another, and in that way, the old ewes can learn new tricks. We'll have more about that as we go along. What let's do, Larissa, at this point is to show a video of this. We used to teach a 2-week short course on all of this stuff, and this was part of what people at that short course would work with the animals and train the animals to do these different things that's being described here. So go ahead, Larissa, with that.
Chloride. This caused nausea and an aversion.
So, Fred, I feel like it's not loaded properly. The actual video is not syncing up with the narration. Do you still want me to
Okay.
play it?
Try it from the start. If it doesn't work, I'll just describe it.
Okay.
I can describe what people would see.
That's a yeah. So I think what's happening is I don't know what's going on, but the um, the video is not playing, but the sound is fine. I think so. I'm not sure how
Okay,
you.
well, No problem. Can you move it forward a little bit like that? That there was a picture there of those ewes and lambs,
All
and
right.
yeah, perfect. So what we did, and this goes back to the very first section that we had. We talked about that if you give animals an excess of something, they'll form an aversion to it. They'll learn to avoid it. And so what we did was to have two different sets of ewes, and one set of ewes we had trained to eat Russian olive and to avoid carrageenan. And the way we trained them to avoid the carrageenan was simply after they ate it, we'd give them a dose of lithium chloride. And within a couple of days, they didn't want to touch the carrageenan, but they'd eat the Russian olive. So now what you're seeing here in this picture, we're turning the lambs out with the mothers. And what it shows so nicely is that the lambs go with mom and they do what she does, even in a little place like this. Now, we had another set of ewes that was trained just the opposite. They would eat the carrageenan and avoid the Russian olive, and their lambs ended up doing the same thing. And so that's what you would have seen if this video would have played. And then at the last, what you would have seen is we turned the lambs out without the ewes being present, and it's
It also
really fun and funny. Yeah, there we go. It's fun and funny to watch because the lambs end up eating. So the C's are on the backs of those lambs that should be eating carrageenan, and then the others should be eating the Russian olive based on their experience with mother. But what you would see if the video could play is they sample a little bit of each thing. So you're getting the lambs influencing the lambs as part of this process. But the video is simply a way to make the words I'm talking about, come alive in all of this, and hopefully you get the idea of it. We'll move on from that, Larissa, and not worry about it at all. That gets the idea across, though. My first experience of all of this was on the ranch with Henry, as I said, but my first experience trying to study this, to actually work with it and think about the implications, came down in southern Utah when we were working with the goats on blackbrush, and we were also working with cattle. And it's very important for me to mention the cattle as well. You know, we often think of cattle as grass eaters, and that's all they can survive on. But if you want to really, for me, it was so eye-opening to see that a creature that's not even thought to be a browser much at all can thrive during the winter, can survive and do very well during the winter on this blackbrush dominated landscape. It is not great quality forage, but when you watched how they had learned to put their heads down and eat blackbrush, it was amazing. So the studies that we did with goats in relation to this were simple. We took one set of goats and had them rear their kids on blackbrush dominated landscape. We had another set of ewes or of nannies with their kids on better quality pasture in Logan, Utah. And then we moved the goats all down to the blackbrush study site and simply looked at how much they ate, how they performed, and so forth. And the goats that had been raised down there on blackbrush ate 2.5 times more blackbrush than did the naive goats. And when we allowed them to choose, when we gave them the choice between blackbrush and then alfalfa pellets, anywhere from 20 to 100% of ad libitum availability on the pellets, the goats that were experienced ate 30% more blackbrush meal in, meal out, day in, day out than did the inexperienced goats at any level of alfalfa pellet availability. So all this was just, and back in those days, there weren't hardly any studies done like this. So it was just a way to ask the question and say, well, what does happen? And it was really eye-opening to me, not only the work with the goats, which was done prior to when we started working with cattle. And I remember the ranchers down there saying, you're going to be amazed when you see what these cattle do on this blackbrush. And I was. So it's all this power of experience to influence what animals are able to do. And as we'll talk about in a few minutes, it's changing form and function of the animals. It's changing morphology and physiology to enable them to better do what they need to do in these environments. It's this really important transgenerational link. That's the same sort of thing that was going on here in this food for thought question. Half of the cows perform really well. The other half aren't doing well at all. Why? Well, as it turns out, the cows that were performing really well as adults had been exposed as calves to ammoniated straw. And that was half of the animals in the group. The other half had never seen ammoniated straw. Throughout all 3 years of that study, the cows that had been fed straw as calves 5 years earlier, and they hadn't seen straw in between. That's a key point. So this is an early experience thing that's playing out later in life. They had higher body weight and condition. They produced more milk. They had shorter postpartum intervals when fed straw as the bulk of the diet during pregnancies from 5 to 8 years of age. This was another eye-opening study to me. The first year, the differences were really large. The next year, they were less. They were still important and statistically significant. By the third year, the differences weren't nearly so large at all, but statistically, they were still significantly different. So there was still an effect 3 years out. And I mention this 3 years because I'm going to come back to it when I talk about livestock producers and some of their experiences changing behaviors of animals. Well, we went on then to look at in utero kind of experiences, having calves exposed in utero to straw or not. And what we found is that if they were exposed in utero, they ate more straw and they were able to digest straw better. And so they grew faster than calves that weren't exposed to straw. So all of this is pointing to the importance of these experiences, not only with mother, but not only with mother after birth, but even prior to birth, in utero, and then through mother's milk and so forth. That fits with studies that some of our friends and colleagues did in Western Australia, where there's a lot of salt brush out in that part of the country. And so they were asking a similar question. Does experience in utero influence intake of salt brush? And they found that lambs exposed to salt brush in utero grow faster. They handle salt loads better than lambs from mothers on pasture. They excrete salt more rapidly, they drink less water, and they maintain higher intake when eating salt brush. So again, it shows not only an effect on what they're doing, but it alludes to this idea that there's changes in form and function that are occurring as a function of experiences in utero. And I'm going to come back and address that here in just a minute. I also want to make a point about learning how to utilize a range, which Henry talked about, learning how to utilize plants in a range. And there were some studies done years ago at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station in DuBois, Idaho. And what they were doing, and this relates to questions that came in, they were selecting for a flock of sheep. They had something like 6,000 sheep up there, but they wanted to select for a flock of sheep that were really sagebrush eaters. Sagebrush is such a dominant plant in the Great Basin of the western and northwestern U.S., and so they were using fecal analyses in a technique that doesn't matter to us. It allows you to evaluate sheep pretty rapidly. And they were able to identify sheep that really ate a lot of sagebrush. And so they selected for a sheep that was able to do things that they wanted done in their country, to thrive locally on these species. And all of us, I say us, as part of that, thought that it was some sort of a physiological adaptation. And we know they occur, that enable animals to utilize plants high in terpenes like sagebrush. But what they found out through more study was that it was a behavioral change that had occurred. The the animals that were eating lots of sagebrush had learned that that's bitter brush as an appetizer helps the sagebrush to go down. Bitter brush, if you recall that first session we did, bitter brush is high in tannins, sagebrush is high in terpenes, and apparently the tannins are binding the terpenes in sagebrush, binding them up, so they're not being absorbed, they're not setting such limits on intake, and the animals can utilize more of it. So I'm simply emphasizing, you have these kind of morphological and physiological adaptations that occur that are influencing behavior as a result of experiences in utero and early in life. But you also have these learned patterns of behavior that become a part of the culture of the herd, which become very important in terms of these local adaptation. And that I think it was the first session we were talking about these goats that ate the wood rat houses and how out of 18 groups of goats during 3 winters, only one group learned to eat those wood rat houses. But functionally, it was really significant. They performed better and wintered better. Um, that's the very same idea as this bitter brush as an appetizer helps the sagebrush to go down, and I could give you many other examples. So it's these kind of strange things, behaviors that develop as a function, one could say, of history, of necessity, and chance-like kind of things that become part of the culture, and that becomes then a very important part of what it means for animals to be locally adapted to the landscapes that they inhabit. And it's not to say that genetics doesn't matter, but it's to say that these genes are being expressed in these environments and that it's really influencing what animals are able to do. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute, but let's talk about habitat selection here for just a second, because the same sort of ideas apply. Why did the moose in Norway winter at higher elevations? Well, it's a cultural thing. It's a cultural thing that's related to human beings, and it's in archaeological time, over thousands, several thousand years ago, that this developed, as these researchers told the story. And what had happened is this population that no longer wintered on the seashores and that spent all of their time at higher elevations in the winter, how that had happened was that humans were pit trapping and hunting that population back in the day, and that changed their behavior. They quit going down because it was uh, lethal to them to try to do that. So you have a change in behavior, and one can imagine that there were changes in morphology and physiology that now allowed this population of moose to thrive at higher elevations year round where their counterparts couldn't. So it wasn't any kind of physical restraint at this point in the game. It was simply culture. And if you think of human beings and the many stories you hear, I remember one about um, chopping off the end of a roast, and the generation after generation did it, and finally one of the kids asked the great grandmother why she did it. She said it wouldn't fit in the pan, and that had been passed from generation to generation. Well, we do those very same things. We become very strongly culture bound, just as the moose were. Um, Same sort of thing is illustrated in some studies in the UK about experiences early in life. And the researchers there did a really interesting study. They had 2 different breeds of animals, Welsh Mountain and Clune Forest. The Welsh Mountain were smaller animals, had 90% lambing success. They lived in the native pastures. They preferred native pasture. The Clune Forest, larger animals, higher lambing rates, and they preferred the so-called improved pastures. That's where they had been born and raised. So what these researchers did then was a cross-fostering experiment. And what that entails is that you have these 2 different breeds, and at birth, what you do is take lambs from the Welsh Mountain ewes and you graft them onto Clune Forest ewes, and you take the ewes from the Clune Forest and graft them onto the Welsh Mountain. It's a technique that works very well, actually. We used it. I'm going to talk about it in a minute, but it's a way to cross foster and then to look at kind of genetic versus learned behaviors as relates to habitat selection in this case here. So they did that. And then they had the foster mother rear the offspring. And then they weaned the ewes and took them out of the picture and left the lambs on those pastures. And what they found was what the lambs went where their foster mother had gone, and they were able to survive and thrive on that on those landscapes, whether it was the uh, native pasture or the improved pasture. So again, in showing the power of experience early in life to influence where animals go. I'll give you one more example of that, and this is from a 5-year study we did in Idaho. It was on a Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service allotment. And we were trying to ask the question, does experience early in life influence habitat selection in cattle in this particular case? And the first year of the studies, we simply went in and observed where animals go. And we found two really distinct populations. One group of animals, it's from the same herd now, let's make that clear. It's the same herd. You take the livestock producer, Pete, would put them up there in the summertime, and they were left there throughout the summer. And they were left to go where they wanted to go. Well, some of the animals spent all of their time in Maxfield drainage. The others spent all of their time in Thompson drainage. So what we did then was a cross-fostering experiment, as I've described, during the winter time. And you can see the young calf there that's been grafted onto to the mother. And then after that, we put the animals up on the summer range, and they went, of course, where their foster mother went throughout that season. And then we weaned them in the fall, and we wintered them together. We wintered all the calves together, and then the next year we put them back up there. So as yearlings, what we found were bigger home ranges than they had expressed with their mothers as calves. And the reason they were bigger is that the calves from both drainages had gotten to be buddies during the winter period, and they were influencing one another's habitat selection. They were spending time with one another. And so, while Maxfield calves would spend more time in Maxfield, they would still spend some time in Thompson, and vice versa. So those circles there are larger circles, are indicating bigger habitat, bigger ranges, and that was the reason. The next year, at 2 years of age, there was a drought, and it dried up Maxfield Creek. It was very interesting to see what happened during that year. The Thompson animals now went back to what they were doing as calves. They spent all of their time in Thompson Creek. The Maxfield animals, though, got very, very large home ranges. Why? They were watering over in Thompson Creek, but still spending a lot of time in Maxfield Creek. So they were exerting a lot of effort to go back and forth, but it's showing that experience early in life and how that was influencing what they were doing. By the third year, the drought had subsided, and the animals went back to doing pretty much what they had done as calves, tied home ranges around what they had learned early in life. So this, again, for me and the other people working on it, was hugely eye-opening in terms of the power of experience early in life to influence where animals went throughout, as far as they throughout their life. And again, it goes back to Henry saying, when he was talking about, how when we go up there, it's not one big herd of cattle. You have all these little subgroups, and they've learned where to go, and their offspring learn where to go. It's that kind of thing that we're observing. So back to this idea then that environments where animals are born and raised influence gene expression, which influences form, that is morphology, function, physiology, and then the behaviors. And it's everything from enhanced neural responses to familiar olfactory cues. When we were doing those studies of goats that had been reared on blackbrush, and we were looking at their organs and organ systems, the goats reared on blackbrush had much bigger rumens. People who pasture rear and advocate that, they talk about changes in morphology, and you've got a bigger chest and girth and so forth. We were finding Rumen volume was different as a function of these experiences early in life. Kidneys, I mentioned that those sheep in Western Australia were able to eat more saltbrush and that they drank less water, excreted salt more rapidly. When they looked at kidney function, it had been totally enhanced. So it's simply to say that there's a whole suite of things that are happening as animals become locally adapted to a landscape. Um, I want to switch now and say a few words about humans, we humans, and then I want to go to some more specific examples about creating locally adapted animals and thoughts about how to do that. But this book here, A Change of Heart by Claire Sylvia, is a, is a is an amazingly interesting book. Claire was one of the first people that ever had organ transplants. She had a heart and a lung transplant, and so this book is about her story. And you might think, as doctors did at that time, that the heart is just a pump. It's a machine. That's all it is. Same for the lungs. The heart's a pump. The lungs are a machine to get oxygen into the body. But she didn't. After what happened to her, she realized that's not the case at all. When you get, as she did, I won't take the time to go through all the story, but she had, it changed her so much when she got this new heart and lung that she had to find out, well, where did they come from? Where, here's this 40-year-old woman, and she comes to find out, well, what she got was the heart and lungs of a 20-year-old young man. And just to illustrate point I want to make here, when she was in the hospital after the surgery, just about to be released from the hospital, she was on an exercise bike, and after she did her workout, the press was there and they were interviewing her. And at the end of the interview, they asked her, if you could have anything you want right now to eat, what would you like? And she said, actually, I'd like a beer. And she said the minute the words came out of her mouth, she wished she could take them back for two reasons. One, it was a flippant response, but two, she said, I don't even like beer. That was her first experience of what some of the changes that had taken place. And she came, as she talks about in that book, to realize that her preferences for food had really broadened out. She came to like things she never liked before, green peppers. She said the first time she was driving down the street, her car nearly steered off the road when she came to a chicken McNuggets. Well, come to find out, these are all foods and many more that Tim, who was the organ donor, had just loved. And the point I'm trying to make then is that these experiences early in life, going back to the flavor feedback we were talking about, and that these different organ systems in our body are influencing our liking for food as a function of their needs, and that the heart has different needs from the lungs, from the brain, and so forth. And so these are learned by our organ systems, and feedback is a way of altering our liking for the food that these organ systems need as a function of their needs. So let's talk a little bit more then, with that in mind, about the origins of human preferences. And there's a rich literature that shows that mothers' diets in utero and experiences early in life with milk and foods, it's amazingly interesting and fascinating kind of literature that's been developed for human beings. And if we had more time, I could tell you story after story of what people have learned about the nuance of that, the power and the nuance of that. But I'm going to stick to just one story here that makes the point, and it's studies done by a lady named Clara Davis, and they illustrate how culture, availability of wholesome alternatives, and flavor nutrient learning can enable health through nutrition. And in June of 1939, so we're going nearly a century ago, Clara, who was a pediatrician in Chicago, told attendees at the 70th annual meeting of the Canadian Medical Association about findings from what's the world's longest and most involved dietary experiment on self-selection in human beings. It was a 6-year study, and in which Clara became, quote, the mother of 15 infants put into an orphanage at very young age, 6 to 11 months. She chose infants for her study because they hadn't eaten adult foods previously, or not much of them. And she stressed they were without preconceived prejudice and biases. She really wanted to control for that. And as she told the Quebec audience, the the people who were working with the infants were told not to give a hint of what those young people should be eating. And so they had a choice, these infants, seasonally, of 34 different foods that are here. Um, and overall, if you select the right combination of those, you can meet your needs for everything you need. But children could have, and this is an important point, by not selecting the right combination of the foods, they could have become deficient. And so what she showed then was that each child typically ate several foods and a beverage at any one meal, including brains, raw beef, bone jelly, bone marrow, foods that are repulsive to many adults. She also points out, as we were talking earlier in this seminar series, no two children, like no two goats or sheep or cows, ever ate the same combination of foods, and no child ever selected the same mix of foods each day. She said, for every diet differed from every other diet. This is a quote, 15 different patterns of taste being presented, and not one diet was the predominantly cereal and milk diet with smaller supplements of fruit, eggs, and meat that is commonly thought proper for this age. When you read about that, I mean, people had really strong pediatricians, had very strong feelings about what, going back to the authority figure, what people should be eating and what they should be feeding their young children. And the children hadn't heard a word about that. She said, to add to the apparent confusion, tastes change unpredictably from time to time, refusing, as we say, quote, to stay put, while meals were often combinations of foods that were strange indeed to us, and one would have been a dietitian's nightmare. For example, a breakfast of a pint of orange juice and liver, a supper of several eggs, bananas, and milk. You know, I have to point out also that there were pediatricians that were watching very closely. They were monitoring the children, and there's papers have been written about it. They say they never saw a healthier set of children ever in their careers. So the children, as she said, achieved the goal, but by widely various means, as heaven may presumably be reached by different roads. Claire concludes the results leave the selection of foods to be made available to young children in the hands of their elders, where everyone has always known it belongs. But as we know, and she wanted to study this, she wanted to study what would happen if you started feeding them not proper choices, if you started into more processed foods, which was starting to come on a bit later on in her career. But we've run that experiment, and food selection wasn't left in the hands of the elders. The choices to be made now influenced by corporate, political, and academic elders, and it's a follow the money kind of thing. It's not necessarily to do with the health of the individuals, and many books, some of them illustrated there, have been written about that topic. And now what's happening not only in the US, but worldwide on ultra processed foods and this pandemic of obesity and diet related diseases. And, I'm going to sound like on a soapbox, I guess, or whatever, but, when you get working with people who look at things from an alternative approach, and I'm talking about dietitians like Sarah Keogh and medical doctors like John Madney, point out, John, over and over again, we treat the symptoms at great expense with medical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, universities get tied in with this. There's a book that my friend Jane Buxton in the UK, forthcoming book that it's a great book. It's titled The Great Plant-Based Con. There's a chapter in there titled Follow the Money. And if there's any doubts about these linkages that are illustrated in this slide, when you read that chapter, they'll all disappear. And so we've got this, this really overweight or obese, 75% of the people, pre-diabetic or diabetic, 50%, metabolically unhealthy. When you start looking metabolically, as John and Sarah do, 88% of the people, and many people couldn't even serve in the military. So it's, it's a big issue. We talked about it last time and put out some ideas for how to get around that. But there's these transgenerational linkages that are really a challenge with all of this. And again, this is well documented in the human literature. Infants born with transmitted generational metabolic syndrome, this whole suite of syndromes that are predispose you toward many non-communicable diseases. But mothers who gain excessive weight during pregnancy, mothers who are obese, mothers who become diabetic during pregnancy are more likely to have fatter babies with higher incidence of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and so forth. And I think of folks I know, and some who had larger families during my generation, and I think of the switch that occurred. I'm thinking of one family where the two oldest kids are thin as can be. They're just no issues. And then I think of how the mother's diet changed as she went along, and the last two just severe issues with obesity. So you can see that before our eyes, and then there's all this form and function kind of things that are going on below the surface that we don't need to spend time on today, but they're all involved in that. And so books have been written about this sort of thing, how the 9 months before birth shaped the rest of our lives. Anne-Marie Paul's book on origins. There's a great Nova special titled Ghost in Your Genes on how genes are expressed in utero and early in life. Just powerful. Watched that many times, and it still sends chills down my spine to think about how all that's taking place and the power of that, but then to think about the power of that on how we might be able to change some of that. And here's some studies, and they're talked about in that video they were doing on mice that were obese. And what they were finding was that if those obese mice were fed supplemental genistein, which is a secondary compound, it changed their coat color and it reduced the incidence of obesity and diabetes. So to me, it was not only illustrating epigenetic influences, but it was also showing that, hey, these kind of things can be reversed if we can have the knowledge. And so Randy Girdle doing fantastic work on that's discussed and is continued. There was also some neat work that was being done by Canadian researchers that were, again, talking initially about the studies on rats, and then they always go back to humans in this Nova special Ghost in Your Genes. But they were talking about the importance of nurturing early in life in terms of calmness. And they were looking at mothers that licked their pups versus mothers that did cross-fostering kind of studies and so forth. But this nurturing early in life, if pups were licked and nurtured a great deal, they were much calmer and they had much less incidence of stress-related diseases as adults. And now, so much is being done along those lines, and the recognition of the ties back to early experience. And you might think from your own standpoint, how much were you licked as a young pup, and how were you licked as a pup? All that influences lifelong kind of responses. So I conclude just the basic kind of material by saying, as Larson did after a 40-year case study, it's my contention that couch potatoes actually begin to develop early in life as tater tots. That's it. So one can go then to this literature and more broadly, as I started out, and you can find these, whether it's otters on a riverbank or cetaceans. There's some wonderful work talking about extended families and relationships and learn patterns of behaviors as they travel throughout the seas, and their knowledge of one another. They're knowing one another. And that's the same with livestock, of course. They all know and recognize one another. Bears in the Arctic, tigers in India, studies with that, Africa. Elephants, amazing work. I'll talk about that later on, but amazing, amazing research has been done on elephants and transgenerational linkages. Same with giraffes. Primates, of course, tons of work's been done on that. And then you can come in your house, with strange kind of things, or somewhere near Walmart. I love this one here because that's kind of where it's funny in a way, and then it's not funny because that's where we are really as a culture. So you raised the question then, what price are we paying by ignoring transgenerational linkages to the social and biophysical environments we have inhabit, and how can we reclaim some of that? So let's talk about then here in this last 20 minutes or so, creating locally adapted herbivores. What can we do to do that? And let's step back just a minute, touch on some of what we've touched on, just to segue us into that. We talked, I think, a bit about the Green Revolution. And again, this isn't by way of the big critic or anything like that. I mean, at the time, and when you read about the intents and what these people were trying to do to feed the population, it made sense. But it took us down paths now that people are really having a big think about. But during that, farm, pasture, and range-based livestock production systems emphasized low diversity of high-producing plants and animals. And what we did really was to abandon locally adapted species, not only of animals, but of plants as well, locally adapted plants and animal species in favor of new strains and breeds, and in a way got, went to where we don't even have our own seeds. We don't keep our own seeds. We moved away from that local adaptation that's so fundamental to not only surviving but thriving in environments. So now, there's so much work, and I'm sure you're all aware of that, on maximizing crop diversity and soil cover, minimizing soil disturbance, maintaining living groups, things that we talked about, and then integrating livestock back into those operations for many, many important reasons. And we talked about last time that there was a cost to going this other direction, the Green Revolution way. It costs to produce a calorie of food requires 2 calories of fossil fuel, as we talked about. We use another 8 to 12 calories to process, package, deliver, store, and cook modern food. No wild species could even survive for any time at all, expending 10 to 14 calories to gain a calorie of energy. And we talked then about what Hagen's paper, The Economics for Future Beyond the Superorganism, and how the energy return on investment is plummeting, and fracking is just kicking the can down the road. So let's talk about then locally adapted creatures and some ideas related to doing that. And I want to start with a story. And this is out of a really interesting and well-written book titled The Last Ranch by Sam Bingham. And in that book, he was talking to an old rancher, George Whitten, and I had the good fortune to meet George when he was probably late 80s, in his 90s, I guess. I was giving a talk at a banquet, and I didn't know that George was there actually. And I was telling this story, and he and his family came up afterwards. We had a wonderful chat, and then we stayed friends ever since then, although George is dead now. But he was talking about in that book, he said, back in 1935, let me back up. So this is a tale about the San Luis Valley in Colorado. It's an amazingly big, beautiful valley. And back in the day, in the early part of the last century, they used to run big sheep operations there, and George had one. And he said, what we used to do was make these big cycles, and we'd winter down in the valley bottom, and there's, shrub, grass mixtures that can really suit the bill, especially if you've got locally adapted animals, which they did. And then he said in the spring, we'd start like wildlife. We'd start to move up. into these higher elevations. So we'd make these big circles around in the high mountains, back down in the fall, and then in the winter onto the to the valley floor. They said back in 35, we had 75-pound lambs and we culled ewes with twins. He said now in 1985, and this is dated as well, but he said now you're selecting for 90-pound lambs and 150% lamb crop. But the point he's making, he said, okay, you're doing this, but your profitability is no more than ours were. You have a lot more input, so you're producing more, but you're not doing it any more profitably. We were just as profitable as you were, maybe more so. And then he points out, he says, our ewes were strong and as well muscled as deer. Yours wouldn't last a day where ours went. So here within the same kind of breeds, talking about what they were able to do with local adaptation. And then he says there was a group of people that wanted to try to recreate the old sheep cycles. And while he appreciated the intent and what they were wanting to do, he also was talking about something I've had many old ranchers tell me about, not appreciating the local adaptation of the creatures and what it takes to get there. So he says they were crazy. Once the knowledge is gone, you can't get it back just like that. They didn't even have a dog that knew anything. When they went through here, you knew they were looking for trouble and they found it. So they had a wreck, basically. And he's talking about when they were moving the animals through. Well, it's this idea that all these behaviors are learned. It takes time to learn these behaviors, to make them become a part of the animals. And it's just fundamental. And if you have the view that I think came on, well, especially as people got away from working closely with animals or at universities, that animals are machines and gene are destiny, and so they just know what to do, you're never going to be thinking about any of these kind of things that we're discussing. If, on the other hand, you realize that animals are involved in the world and that they're they're learning and there's all these linkages that are altering form, function, and behavior, you take a totally different view of all of this. So what I want to say then is that old dogs can indeed learn new tricks, but young dogs learn them quicker. Age and challenge influence how quickly animals can learn. And we wrote so many papers about this based on the experiences of research and then about livestock producers. So let me share just a bit of that with you. The first thing is to realize that when you change behavior, it takes time for the whole system to adjust. And this can be on the order of 3 to 5 years. I was just reading a 15-year study talking about the importance of plant diversity and what happens when you go from 1 to 60 different plant species on a landscape and when you change that, and how many years are involved as that system makes the changes below ground and above ground. It was really some nice research. And so soils, they don't change instantly. It takes years for that to occur. I remember reading papers about when people switch from inorganic to organic, and they're talking about that it can take 3 to 5 years for the life in those soils to really come back and be altered. And they were making the same point in this 15-year paper. They were still seeing changes 15 years into it. So the plants, the diversity, the soils, the animals needing to learn new patterns of behavior, and then the people themselves. So you, in terms of what we could call system performance, you want to get to another place for economic reasons, for ecological reasons, for social reasons, all those factors that influence what and how you produce. But I think realizing that there's this adaptation trough and that many times things get worse before they get better was very important. During our 10-year Behave program, we talked so much about that. And when I say we, it was livestock producers, researchers. We were all really keenly aware and talking about that because people were innovating and then thinking about, are there ways that we can reduce the depth of that trough, basically? What can we do to try to help everybody get through that? And it goes beyond what we have time to discuss right here. I'm going to give you a little bit, But there's a booklet that I wrote, and there's a DVD that came out on all that. It's titled Foraging Behavior, Managing to Survive in a World of Change. And Larissa, I'm happy to share a PDF of that booklet with you if anybody's interested in it. It's livestock producers telling the stories about this stuff that I'm trying to tell. And so people like Ray Bannister and Bob Budd. Ray Bannister totally, and when I read the one question here about the biggest, baddest bull, or should you go local adaptation, Ray has the most amazing stories about that sort of thing. And there was a while in his career, Ray has about, I think, 7,000 acres in eastern Montana. He's a wonderful, wonderful person and a character to, in the best sense of the word. Um, but we shared a lot of years together and a lot of stories. He would call me at 6 in the morning. Well, people tell me animals shouldn't, cattle don't eat this plant, and we'd start exploring that. I think I mentioned that earlier on, but he changed his grazing, and he went the big expensive bull route too. And he's got a very funny story about that. What happened to his bull, and then he finally got around, as he says, to range management, to managing animals and managing the landscape, and just realized the power of what you can do when you got involved. But what Ray said, and we talk about this in this booklet that I wrote. I said it took 3 years to get through that trough, and his weaning weights plummeted. He didn't have, the first year it was terrible. Next year better, but third year he was sailing and he was more profitable. That was, it wasn't to do it just to do it. It was because he had goals in mind that were going to help his profitability. Bob Budd talked about the same thing in his case, though, and there's wonderful video we have on that of Bob talking about his experience at Red Canyon Ranch. Bob's a fourth or fifth generation rancher, very incredibly interested in conservation, though, and so it's influenced where he's gone in his life. And he was doing what I'm going to talk about now. He's at Red Canyon Ranch, managing that for the Nature Conservancy. And when he took over, there were like 200 cows, all living in the riparian areas, beating the bottoms up. And so, among many things that Bob did in terms of showing, his whole goal is to show you can blend ranching with conservation. And he's done that in so many wonderful ways throughout his career. But what he decided was to hire a rider and retrain the cattle herd. And so Travis Clyde's job was every day to ride and move those cattle out of the bottoms. And first year was the worst. It was pretty tough. They had all this uplands that the cattle weren't using, but day in, day out, moving them up, and then taking notes. Which are the worst offenders? Which are the ones that are just habitually, no matter what I do, they want to stick down there in the bottoms? And in the fall, they got culled. The ones that were learning, they got kept. Well, you can imagine. So the first year, you have calves starting to learn from those cows. Now they were keeping their own replacements, like Henry did. The next year, you've got this group of calves that, hey, they've learned that the uplands aren't so bad. By the third year, you've got a herd that's learning the bottoms aren't good, the uplands are where to be. And Travis has worked himself out of a job, as Bob says. It's a great video we've got on that. But Bob just telling the story of how important that was, and then talking about profitability and talking about the rider. And he concludes, the rider will pay for the rider and probably a whole lot more after he's giving his spiel on it. And we did economics on that when we were doing the work with Bob, and it's true what he was saying. So, you can change food and habitat selection behaviors. Why? Because they're learned, and you have all these dynamics going on. So as they're saying then, fossil fuels enabled people then in a way to select for animals that lack the ability to thrive on foods and habitats available to them. And I'm going to show you another example here from a rancher in Oregon. And, in the West anyway, and I think probably pretty much across the country, when you look at costs, much of the cost of ranching is due to feeding hay in the winter, the feeding it during the winter, irrigating, cutting, hauling, baling hay, and all the machinery. So people we were working with back in the day, their goal was to get out of all that. They wanted to get rid of the machinery and start to have in cases where they could, animals that could forage out. Now, this example here was work we were doing with sagebrush. And we were showing, sagebrush is, people don't like it because it's taken over a lot of lands because of too intensive spring grazing out in the west, and getting rid of grasses and forbs, stimulating growth of sagebrush. And so it's viewed as something an invasive that people want to get rid of. They never view it as a forage resource. Well, if you're raised with wildlife species, you know that 30% of their diet during the winter is sagebrush. It's a nutritious plant. And you come to realize through studies we've done that terpene concentrations during the fall and winter in sagebrush. So it becomes a nutritious plant and a source of protein that can match then the dormant mature grasses and forbs that are in a community. Well, Matt Carter attended a workshop that we did talking about some of our work on this, and he went back to Oregon. He started to think about what he was doing, and he thought about all the sagebrush ground that he had and all the efforts that he had put into money and effort trying to get rid of sagebrush. And he started out thinking, we were showing that if you've got a monoculture of sagebrush, if you supplement animals with a little bit of alfalfa, for instance, which he was feeding, that helps them to utilize even more sagebrush than you might expect. And so he thought, as a start, I'm gonna feed some hay out on my sagebrush ground and see what happens. And what he saw as an invasive, horrible plant came to be seen as a forage resource. And one of the years of the Behave program, I twisted his arm and he was coming to our annual meetings, but I got him to give a talk. He was very nervous, but it was a fabulous talk of his story of what had happened over the several years that he had made that switch, and how he wished he had a dime for every dollar he'd spent trying to get rid of sagebrush, because it was a forage resource now. And in addition, his cattle were helping to rejuvenate that landscape. By utilizing sagebrush, they were reducing its abundance and stimulating the abundance of grasses and forbs. So it's a local example, but it lets a person realize that he was able to cut greatly back on how much hay he was feeding. I'm thinking now of folks at Deseret that totally got sold all the machinery. They were able to started wintering cattle on all these different landscapes that they had, totally different environment in terms of where they were wintering. But again, they were talking about this adaptation trough, and that it takes time for their animals to learn how to do that, and all the things we're talking about. So I guess the point would be, like their wild ancestors, domestic livestock can learn to be locally adapted to the environments they have. And every one of these pictures here is an example of story that I could tell, and videos that we have, and the stories are in that booklet. The top ones there are in the bayous of Louisiana, and moving animals from uplands down into these wet marshy areas. And when they say uplands, we're talking a few feet up in elevation is an upland. And then the blackbrush that I've talked about, and then dairies, when you go from total confinement to pasture-based dairying, and realizing that these animals need to learn. When they've been born and raised in the barn and they go out to pasture, they don't necessarily know pasture is food, and their bodies don't know that either. And so, all that's in this booklet, and it's in the DVD as well, with the different people telling their stories. So what are some things that a person can do? There was a question in there of, which animals do you retain, and questions related to matching what you're doing in the landscape with your goals, your overall goals. Well, thinking about what it is that you want to accomplish and how to do that in low cost ways, but retaining animals that can survive only on what nature provides seasonally in the landscapes is one place that so many of these ranchers we were working with started, and we pitching in with them on all of that business. And I think of Jim Garish's book, Kick the Hay Habit, where he's talking about, all across the U.S., including up into Canada and deep snow country, and that Animals can learn to do that if you have the forages available to them. If you've got the forage resource base to do it, animals can learn to do it. But again, that adaptation trough, I think, becomes so important, because if an animal's been fed hay its whole life, and all of a sudden you're going to not feed hay anymore, you're going to see horrible changes in animal performance. So there's nuance to how you wean them onto that. And I don't remember, I think I may have mentioned this in an earlier session, maybe I didn't, of where we retrained a whole herd of elk. Maybe I'm mixing up sessions here with this, but different webinars. But we retrained a herd of 1,000 elk at Deseret that had they had been fed hay for 20 years, and so kind of a long, very interesting story. But for sake of time, I won't do it. But we were able to get that job done. And then you think about how you do that, and how do you do it in ways that you don't totally crash your populations, that you get them to eat what you want, to be in the places you want. All that becomes nuance of how you actually do these things. And if there's interest in wanting to go into more of that next winter, we could really focus specifically on some of those kind of things. But this idea of, if you have the possibility, then you start to think about, how do you call, how do you do it, and how do you try to get through that trough in ways that you don't totally wipe yourself out and the animals with it, that you take as little of a hit as possible. All that becomes really important. So retain animals that can survive on what nature provides seasonally. Match production cycles to seasonal availability of forage. I think Kit Farrow makes such an important point of this, and I I couldn't agree more with this idea of thinking about what wildlife do in the environment. When do they have their babies? And that's when nature's providing the groceries that she needs during the last trimester of pregnancy, and then during lactation. And it also sinks those young animals in, because they're in the womb during the time that mom's eating these really poor quality forages on the landscape, if you're grazing year round. So you're really setting up everything that I've talked about up to this point to succeed, in terms of fall winter maintenance, spring summer reproduction, and so forth. And then it goes without saying, rearing offspring with their mothers, or they'll be expected to produce as adults. And this isn't for everyone, and so forth, but creating families based on epigenetic and learned abilities of matrilineals to use diets and habitats. I've got a slide in here in a minute that's going to just simply make the point that when cattle, sheep, and goats aren't go feral, if you let them go feral, they end up in extended families. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute, so this will make more sense. But this takes us back then to this idea, or this story that I told at the beginning. And Frank Meyer saying bison weren't in these enormous herds. They were in these small little groups. And he said, keep them in mind. They're important to us in our hunting, and in fact, they formed the basis of our attack. He said, let me tell you how. He said, at the head of each of these little herds would be its leader, but the leader wasn't a courageous old bull ready and willing to whip the universe. It wasn't a bull at all. It was a cow, a sagacious old cow who, by the power of her intellect, had made herself the leader. Buffalo society, you see, was a matriarchy, and the cow was queen. Wherever she went, the others, including the big bulls, who should have known better than to follow a woman, and I swear that's in here, I'm not making that up, they went. When she stampeded, they stampeded. When she got into trouble, they didn't know what to do. Our job as runners was to get her into trouble as soon as we could, and then the rest was easy. And what they did, when he makes a point of this, and it may sound gruesome, he said it was critical not to kill the matriarch outright, but to wound her. And so she's suffering, and none of them would leave her. Her family would not leave her. And so then they would shoot all of the members of the family. And it wasn't because they're stupid. It was because of their loyalty to one another and to the matriarch. it was an amazing thing, and they learned about that, and that was important in their success. But then that relates to broader issues. Bison live in extended families, just as he said. You can get into the nuance of how these families function in landscapes, which is amazing. Sometimes they operate democratically, sometimes they operate despotically. There's just, as you get into family and that, it's amazing. And years ago, I had a wonderful opportunity to go to South Africa with one of my PhD students who was from South Africa. And so he toured us throughout the country. It was amazing to see the wildlife, the people, everything that he was able to show us. One of the places we went, though, was to Addo Game Park, and it's an elephant game park. And we went out with the biologists who had spent their lifetimes there studying those elephants, and they knew every elephant by name. Every one of them was named. And so when a herd would come in, we were at the watering hole very early in the morning. They could click right down the list. Well, this is Lucy and this is Jerry and whatever. They knew all the names, and then they said, and here's the newest addition to the family, Matilda or whatever. But their knowledge of those extended families and what they did in the environment, and then some of this knowledge that spans decades and decades of during a drought, where do you go if you're a family? And then the work that was being done to show that as they wipe out a bunch of those families and you have young groups that don't have this long-term knowledge, how they weren't nearly as successful as some of the groups with the older, more mature females. It just lets you realize the power of these linkages. And then they just told stories about moving families when they wanted to reintroduce animals into new environments, and how originally they would kind of trap willy-nilly, but as they came to appreciate the families, they realized they had much better success moving animals to unfamiliar environments, which is a big challenge, obviously, if they moved the entire family. Um, so the value of that, these social relations, these social interactions that we talked about when we were talking about feedlots, and you just take everybody and throw them in the feedlot, and the stress that creates, and the poor performance. And then there's stories about moving bulls, and these huge bulls. That's a big deal to try to move them, but they're linked with those families as well. And I I heard this story several times from different people about how when you don't move the mature bulls with the family, some of these young bulls will come into heat, come into must. And the old cows that are part of that family are not interested in breeding the bulls. And you know how young males are related to things like that. So, it's causing a lot of disruption. And this story, and I swear I've heard it more than once, about one of the young bulls trying to breed the white rhinos that were around. So it was a mess for everything. But what they realized is if you do move these big bulls, then there's an order that's there. And I remember the senior biologist that was giving us a seminar on this said, I think we're just, even as much as we've learned, I think we're just beginning to learn about all the dynamics that goes on within these families. It was moving and very, very powerful kind of stuff. So, as I say, this whole family business occurs within livestock as well, and it may or may not work for everyone. But keeping your own replacements as part of groups, that can be an important part of the linkages of this, and creating in your own way. I'm thinking of a late friend of mine, Nan Bray in Tasmania, that has totally taken on this idea of extended family. She runs sheep down there in Tasmania, and it's amazing to read what she's written about what's happened as she moved more toward families in her sheep operation. And I'll just leave it at that for now. If anybody's interested, I can get you in touch with Dan, or give you some of the writings and what she's seen, the changes in behavior of animals and the confidence of animals and what animals learn as she's moved more and more in that direction. So, Larissa, let's give it a try. I hope this one will come up. Um, This is
So,
a.
Fred,
Let
let me just
me,
tell you, in the interim, since at the last video, I was on the line with tech support, and apparently there is some kind of server issue that is making the audio and the visual not work together, but I can definitely try to see if it's been fixed. Otherwise,
okay.
I could
Let
probably screen share it. I don't know if this one's narrated or not. Or is there just music in it?
no. Let me tell you what it is, and it's not narrated at all. It's simply when we started our studies of bison, and Bob Jackson is the person who really got us thinking about that and involved with it. He's a bison producer in Iowa, does fantastic kind of things with extended families and everything that's going on. But we went to Yellowstone as part of that. He was a backcountry ranger for 30 years in Yellowstone. Spent his in the most remote part of the park, working with all the creatures and humans and so forth. But obsessed with bison, just absolutely obsessed. And so we went to Yellowstone as part of this, and we spent a day with Bob, or a couple of days, and we this video segment takes place on the it's on the Yellowstone River. It's along the Yellowstone River, and there's this big bunch of bison down there, like Frank Meyer talks about. You think there's this massive herd, but he said, "Okay, we're going to just sit here all afternoon. We're going to watch, and you'll see as these bison start to take off. It's not one big bunch. It's all these little families. It's what he referred to as satellite groups that have broken off. When a family gets too big, you get satellite groups that break off, and another family form." And so it's simply in my mind, a beautiful video of watching these bison um, put to music. So that's what it is, and I hope it'll come up. To me, it's a beautiful way to end this discussion of all that we've been talking about. And you'll see at the last these bison. There's this small group, part of a family, and they're crossing the Yellowstone, and they've got a young calf with them, and you can see the mother and probably the aunts and so forth. So, okay,
Is it working, Fred?
the bison are going, but there's no music to it.
Yeah, I think that's the only issue with doing it from my screen share is the music is
It's gone.
yeah.
Is there any way I could show it on mine?
Um, I, it's it's just part of the system. Let me just stop it for a
Yeah.
second. Yeah, that's the thing. That's why I had it all uploaded. Unfortunately, with the server, it's
Well,
not working.
I tell you what, Larissa, if you could back it up to the start.
Yep.
We'll jerry rig this thing totally here, huh? What I'm going to do, I'm going to start mine when you start yours, and it'll just have the music there. It adds to the whole
Okay.
thing, believe it or
Let's see if
not.
we can do this. Ready? Go.
Yeah. So hopefully that worked, huh?
Hopefully, let's see if I can get out of the
Out of the mode, huh?
and show. Okay. Back here. Okay. And I'll pull up our slides again. Yeah, sorry folks for that. That was us working on the fly to make it somewhat presentable. Okay, so there you go, Fred.
No, good, perfect. No worries. The technology, like we say. So just to conclude, then, we stress genetics as a mechanism of evolution and in livestock production, and certainly genetics matter, huh? This far side, one says earthquakes are coming, the other, yep, mysterious innate intuitions of some animals. But what we don't appreciate is all this that we've been talking about, genes, dialoguing continually, social and biophysical environments. And when I see that video and see that little young calf at the last of that bison, learning how to become one of the herd in Yellowstone, in that particular part of Yellowstone National Park, huh? How to avoid natural selection, dare to be nocturnal, do it by instinct, and hibernate the easy way, and so forth. So I conclude simply by saying animals, including humans, aren't machines and genes aren't destiny. Animals are involved in the world, which helps us and them to evolve with the world. And there's so much possibility when we actually get into that. And so, with that, I know, like usual, Ursula, gone over a little bit, and we'll call it good, huh? On that.
Perfect. Yes. Yeah. I mean, thank you, Fred. I'm proud of us for putting that together. I know there's been a ton of chatter in the chat box, mostly back and forth between folks. I'm looking back up. I'm going to scroll back up and see. I think there was at least a couple questions. There were quite a few requests for the handbook or the booklet that you referred to, and perhaps we could put together a bibliography of the various articles and books and other resources that you mentioned. Folks were very interested in that. That's possible. Let's see. I'm scrolling back up. I know I saw one way up here. I think it was from, let's see, over an hour ago. I don't know if Janice is still on, but her question is, a lot of livestock rearing systems, especially dairies, have gone over to total mixed rations. They are ground to a small enough particle size so that animals can't sort. The rations are very carefully balanced and are quote unquote said to be excellent for animals, but the animals have no choice. So I've always wondered, wondered what is the effect of, even if the nutrients are optimized, what does it do to take away their choice?
Yes, excellent question, and goes back to that first session where we were, and this again, what ruminant nutritionists have learned about nutrition of livestock is amazing, and incredibly valuable. And the ability to formulate rations is very nuanced and again incredibly valuable. The one thing you can't get around, though, with a total mixed ration is that every individual in a herd is absolutely unique. And I showed a lot of data on that earlier on. It's just such a fundamentally beautiful part of the way nature is. I remember talking with an old friend who's dead now, and he was in his 80s when I saw him, and we walked into his house. He'd been looking at bluebirds, and just out of the blue, he said, they're magnificent, and no two individuals are alike. And I thought, that's amazing, Carl, that you say that. I came to that through a lot of study, but you somehow you just, well, and working with cattle. But that's the problem. And we were talking about earlier that there's an efficiency. If you offer choices, there's an efficiency that gets into that, because each individual can select what it needs if you're giving a proper range of choices. And even the example I gave was fairly limited, 5 choices. But even at that, we saw a 24% reduction in cost because we were allowing animals to choose. So that's the bugger in it all, is that or the beauty of it, but the bugger if you're trying to do feedlot rations or total mixed rations for animals in confinement, and um, that'll never go away. Every individual's unique, no matter how uniform the group you put together. So that's yeah, it's I think a good question, and really links us back to that first presentation that we did.
Absolutely. And maybe one more question that just came in. I've been wondering about landrace and terrier, and I'm wondering if and I apologize if I'm saying those incorrectly, Dr. Provenza can elaborate on either of these as it relates to livestock plants, both the stock of the animal and also the experience of the human on the other side as a consumer of that animal.
Yeah, that goes back too to some of what we were talking about related to the plants, the animals, and then the human as consumer of those animals as well, huh? And the linkages that get in there in systems related to the health of all the components of the system below ground, above ground, and then us as a part of those linkages as well. I guess I would say related to that without trying to get too much more long-winded. I will say too, in relation to where you very started, Larissa, I'm happy. I'll send you a PDF of that booklet that you can share with everyone, and any other materials that people want. More than happy to share with them. And if people do want some of the questions that get asked, we really get kind of specific, as life is, huh? You can talk in generalities about principle and process. I was visiting with an ecologist early this morning about work that he's doing, and we were just so agreeing that everything becomes so local to your place and your animals and your plants. And I often think, that's the beauty. If a person's willing to get involved, you can paint your own canvas. You're the artist that's painting the canvas. And I was telling you, when I wrote Nourishment, I started out with that point in the first chapter. The chipmunk that lived in our wood pile is different from the chipmunk down the road in form and function and everything else and what it knows. And so I'm happy though. And so some of the questions, needing to know more about the specifics of the place and what's going on, is important. And I'm happy to either by email or phone visit with folks about some of that.
And that's a good segue into, I wanted to mention some follow-up stuff to folks that I will be sending out an email tomorrow with a copy of this recording and the slides, and I'll CC Fred on as well if there are other follow-up questions you want to get in touch with him about. All of the recordings of these sessions and the slides, and if there are other resources that we get, I will post. Everything so far is posted on the URL that is here. So that's a good way to kind of keep everything in one place if you want to go back and access any of the sessions that we've put together this year, and hopefully we'll add to that next year. It sounds like there's a lot of interest. This is the last webinar of our spring season. I know folks are getting busy and it's hard to sit inside of the computer. So we will resume our sessions later in the fall. So keep an ear out for that. We do have some other opportunities in the meantime if folks are interested in scholarships. We also have some personalized handouts that we developed. So I'll include links to those in my follow-up email. But Fred, it's been such a wonderful couple of weeks. I can't believe 3 weeks are over, but I know I speak on behalf of many people when I say that it was really a pleasure to spend these afternoons with you. And, I'm really glad that we were able to organize these sessions and that we had access to your nuggets of wisdom and experience and good stories, kind of pulling it all together. It's, when you have the research and the data, and then you can actually see the bigger picture. I think that's what really drives home a lot of these points. So thank you for sharing all that and spending so much time with us. But
yeah, well, you're welcome, Larissa, and I thank all the people that tuned in to the web. It's an honor and a privilege. And and what's fun is not only to share the science, but to link that in with real life people, with livestock producers for the stories of all what's going on. And I saw a thing pop up on there, and I'll just make one. It was about nourishment. If you're interested in this topic and really want to delve into it, nourishment has it in it in spades. It's far more than what I was able to cover here, but the flavor is certainly of what I gave was, is in that book. But there's a lot of stories, and this booklet that I'll send you, Larissa. But thank you very much. It's been wonderful to work with you. Time flies, huh?
It really does. It really does. Yes, thank you. I wanted to extend a thank you to everyone in the audience and for being with us as well. And please give us some feedback on that survey that will pop up in just a moment. And I hope that we'll stay in touch and you'll be on future webinars and take advantage of other opportunities and services. So yay. All right, everyone. Have a great evening and spring, and we'll talk with you soon.
Take care, Larissa.